Thank you to Ben for inviting me, and thank you for your paper discussion. I'm probably going to come at this from a different angle, partially because I
push the microphone.
Do I need more to be louder?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I don't believe in the sacred in that sense, in the sense of holy or non-material. But I will talk a bit about what sex positivity is and its value, I think, for society. It's a pretty big tent. Primarily, sex positivity is an attitude that sex is good. Good for reproduction, good for reproduction and making family, good for creating attachment and community, good for pleasure, good for personal growth and self-exploration, good for comfort, and good for lots of other things too. It's also the understanding that an individual's sexuality is best integrated into a healthy self when there's information and conversation to help in reflecting on what sex means to that individual. In addition, sex positivity has only one hard and fast rule: consent. While individuals may have plenty of other rules for themselves, or perhaps even opinions about what other people do in general, there's an understanding and ethic of not applying your rules to others who have different values, and that shaming people around sex is oppressive and even dangerous. I think that I can comfortably call this summary mere sex positivity. And as you can see, it includes many thoughts, experiences, and approaches to sexuality, including the choice or the desire to not relate sexually at all. Even though sex positivity is a broad notion, the writing and thinking that come out of it have a rather distinct flavor. It tends to take its starting point from what people actually do rather than from what people ought to do. That is where I think sex positivity differentiates itself from what some may view as sexually liberal writing about sex, i.e. the stuff Hughes find in Cosmo. It was hard to find a summary to give to you, about what sex positivity actually is, because the philosophy tends to be mixed with the practice. People talk about their own experiences, a little bit of sort of philosophizing about that comes out, and so it's difficult to find something sort of concise. Extracting from my own reading and thinking about sex positivity, I'll say this. Sexual desire is incredibly strong, and it is personally and culturally and politically loaded, and it can be the center of a great deal of personal conflict and frustration. While healthy human beings can choose how they express their desires in any given moment, willpower is limited, and over the long haul, not making positive space for the things that one wants exacts a cost in happiness and overall effectiveness in life. Desires do not need to be changed unless they obstruct the rights or well-being of others, or perhaps seriously disrupt one's life. And when I say that, I mean sort of in one's own perception, that they disrupt one's own life, not sort of, not according to someone else. Sexual desires are flexible and can be meaningfully channeled or changed for reasons that are meaningful to the person who has them, helpfully channeled or changed for the reasons meaningful to the person who has them. But when political, social, and cultural institutions pathologize desire, they hurt individuals. And I think they also not only hurt individuals, but they hurt individuals' efforts to meaningfully make the changes that they want regarding their desires. Because, as many therapists will say, acceptance is the first step to change. Self-acceptance is the first step for change. When cultural, social, and especially political institutions pit important human desires, connection to family and community, freedom from incarceration, ability to support oneself financially, and full social participation against against a person's or individual's legitimate, meaning consensual sexual desires and activities, then that is oppression in the same way that making someone choose between their religion and their ability to support themselves is oppression. Sex is an important part of being human. We present to the world as human beings, as sexual beings. At the same time, the kind of sex that a person has is not so important as to undermine their worth as human beings or to undermine their fitness to participate in all aspects of human lives. Prostitutes don't deserve to be raped, killed, or humiliated any more than do virgins. No one should lose their job or their custody of their children or be thought less fit for public office because they engage in non-mainstream sexual behaviors, including legal sex work. For this reason, there are some things that don't belong in sex positivity's big tent. For example, homophobia and the shaming of others around sex. One kind of work that the sex positive movement, I think, really has yet to do and needs to do is to think seriously about people's choices to refrain from acting out their desires. But I still think this has to come from fundamentally a place of acceptance, radical acceptance, and not aversion or shame. So what value does this approach bring culturally? I think it has a lot of values in our discussion in thinking about and creating liberation around gender oppression, racial oppression, class oppression. Oppressed groups are often represented in ways that are over-sexualized or that are desexualized. Sometimes even activists for oppressed groups, some kinds of feminists are really good examples of this, encourage a kind of desexualization as a way to garner respect. But it's impossible for minorities to be accepted as human beings if we aren't accepted as sexual beings. If women, for example, if women's dignity is contingent on our not being too sexy, we're never going to have dignity. And if a woman can be insulted as a person for not being sexy enough, then we still don't have dignity. We have to accustom ourselves to the idea, we all, women and all other people interested in that sort of project, have to accustom ourselves to the idea that someone can be highly sexual, publicly sexual in a way that we would never do ourselves and still have human dignity. One of the other values that I think sex positivity as a movement and as a philosophy brings to the culture right now is an emphasis on consent. Not just consent in trying to twist somebody into giving consent or sort of do you want to yes or no kind of consent, but in really talking about what one wants and making sure, taking personal responsibility for the other person getting what they want and also being cared for in any kind of sexual encounter. I think this is one of part of the value of the BDSM, the bondage and discipline and sadomasochistic community. They brought that a lot, I think, to sex positivity. This emphasis on consent, this emphasis on negotiation, and very explicit kinds of negotiation and consent. Also, the emphasis on education. Yeah. We have seen now, we've had about 20 years of abstinence-only education. This is in the case of children, but I think this has implications for adults as well. We see that some kinds of abstinence-only education delays the onset of sexual activity for middle schoolers at least, but in general, a more comprehensive approach is better for disease prevention and preventing teen pregnancies. Access to information about sex and about other kinds of self-care develops confidence and empowers people. Shared information also creates community for sexual minorities. And I think in this case, the sex positivity movement has learned a lot from the LGBT pride movement. One important lesson here is that people need to be able to live their sexual orientation and their gender identity publicly. Sex acts are private, but the identities that those acts involve are public ones and are linked to public communities, especially if you're a sexual minority. When there is socially imposed shame around a person's sex acts, then that shame colors the experience of the identity associated with those acts. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to create a life of integrity and mental health in the face of that shame. It is even more difficult to raise a healthy family. In our culture, one's sexual choices are often connected to one's family structure. So in order to have a healthy family with open communication, one has to be able to intentionally and freely make those choices with reference to one's own values, needs, and desires.
You have 1 minute.
Okay, thanks. So sort of to conclude, perhaps not on the individual, perhaps not necessarily on the individual level, but I do argue that on a social, cultural, and political level, that our values around sexuality need to focus on information, consent, and information and consent and communication. Not necessarily on the development of a sense of specialness or privilege around in certain areas of life. That can happen